No button. Can you guys hear me? I'm not too sure if people can hear me or not. If you could just type into the discussion. You can. Excellent. Okay. Sorry about that. A bit of confusion there. But for some reason, last time I got straight into the track. This time, for some reason, the system lost me. But I'm here now, thank goodness. So I'm going to kick off, assuming that's okay, and start sharing my slides. Let me just give me 2 seconds to do that. So you can see my slides okay. Let's see. Can you see my slides? Let's see if anyone can see that. Okay. Yes, I can see a yes. I'm going to take that as a that's all working. Brilliant. Okay. So please feel free to ask me any questions as we go along. I'm going to try and keep track of the discussion kind of aspects. The aim of this is to sort of go into a bit more detail. I'm fascinated by what's happened in the hyper-casual space, but not just because of hyper-casual games themselves, but what they say profoundly about the way we can think about game design. I'm also obsessed with games as a service. In fact, I literally wrote the book on the subject. So if you go look on Amazon, look for games as a service, you'll find that there's a book out there. I'm not here about to sell my book at all, far from it. I've been around in games since 1998. I'm not too sure how many of you were alive then or not, how many of you were kids then, but I was starting out in online gaming at the time when the best way to connect to the internet was over a dial-up modem. Yes, that was such a thing, before broadband even. I've worked on that kind of PC console, first-person shooter kind of experience. I also was one of the pioneers in mobile gaming back in the days of Java. I was the global lead for Hutchison Whampoa, the Chinese conglomerate who ran an organization called 3. I talk a lot about my time at 3. I was also a home architect on a thing called PlayStation Home, which would have been brilliant had it been around now. It was a social virtual world experience. Sadly got shut down in 2015, but we learned so much. And in fact, you would never believe it, but that was the first console free-to-play experience. And that was before we had free-to-play really taking off on mobile. I was an evangelist at Unity for a while, and early this year, we really kicked off our live ops as a service company, fundamentally games. So ready to seed round for that. So there's a bit of brief around who I am. But if you've been to any games conference, particularly Pocket Gamers, you've probably seen the hat. Okay, so let's kick off. What are we here to do? Let's define some terms. So hyper-casual, by which I mean simple, fail fast, low cost, mass market games. So they're really simplistic. They're very simple. One interaction, one moment of play, but enough desire to replay that keeps the game compelling. And they're ad funded. Now, you see lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ads if you're a hyper-casual game, but we seem to get away with that with hyper-casual. In fact, the ad themselves become delightful to the extent that it's time to break from the intensity of gameplay. So that's what I think of as hyper-casual. Obviously, if you have a different view or a different thought, just feel free and happy to sort of discuss that in more detail. But we will come into more on that later. Next, games as a service. What do I mean by games as a service? Well, for me, it's this idea of living games. And if you were part of the, if you're watching the panel we had earlier, where we had Fawzi, Paul and Dean from Perfect World talking about living games, you'll already know what we mean. But for those who weren't, it's about an ongoing, engaged, retaining experience, which people don't just play today or tomorrow, but they keep playing for days, weeks, months, even years. Some of the longest term games, the MMOs of this world, things like RuneScape, has been around for over 20 years. Not every game is going to be like that, but even Candy Crush, which Fozzie worked on, has been around for 10 or so years. Well, maybe not quite, but it's around that kind of, well, I should work out how long it's been out there. It's been out there for a long time. But the important thing is that rather than being mass market, they generally are more focused audiences. I say generally, but let's leave it for that. They also have mixed monetization. So they're not just reliant on ads, and they don't just throw ad after ad after ad after you. In fact, if they did, they would probably churn your experience too fast. You'd want to get rid of them. You'd want to run away. You'd hate them. You want to move away from it if you had too many ads. Something we don't seem to be too worried about when we do hyper-casual. So anyway, that's my definition. Hopefully we were all with me on that, and we'll move on from there. So let's look at a hyper-casual game. Now, this is just some data from Reflection. I'm a big fan of the Game Refinery guys, and Reflection is a tool that they acquired last year. But the reason I chose Plank, it's an old game, but it's got a nice, clean graph that illustrates my point. If you look at the downloads, you can see this massive initial spike, and then it drops down. There's a little bit of a spike in between, and then it levels out. That is a life cycle of a typical product. It's also the life cycle of a typical hyper-casual game. Now, you will notice that also, not only is the download shape that, but the revenue shape is the same, more or less. There are some differences. So, for example, it's slightly higher in its peaks around the sort of October 2018 to sort of December 2018. But, that's kind of it's not so far out from the downloads. There's more or less a one-to-one relationship between downloads and revenue. So I think it's worth thinking about hyper-casual in that case. So what's going on with hyper-casual in that context? So let's break down the development. How do you develop a hyper-casual game? I'm not sure how many of you are doing that. Obviously, please feel free to tell me if you are. But essentially, what we're looking at with hyper-casual games is we need a vast number of ideas. Idea. In fact, it's actually really good for us. Because if we realize that ideas are worthless, that's not quite true, but it's about the execution. Execution is everything. And what's joyful, if we have our right mindset, if we think about making hyper-casual games like game jams, it's let's experiment. Let's try a mechanic. What's the one interaction? What's the context we're going to put that in? What environment, what shape, what camera? But what's the one thing we do, and what's the result? And why is that fun? Getting that kind of experience, perfect summation of simplicity. If we can get that one experience right, and then move on to the next one, move on to the next one, move on to the next one. The key thing is we keep the build time incredibly low. Why? Because it keeps our costs incredibly low. We can try, we can experiment, and most importantly, we can learn what works because we immediately go into market testing. Interestingly, how market testing has evolved. So nowadays we're doing essentially a Facebook, it doesn't have to be Facebook, but I'll say Facebook ad, a video trailer. And we try to see how many people go to a website, to a fake store page, if you like, just to see what the cost of install would be for that idea. Can you encapsulate your idea in a 30-second video ad and see how successful that idea can be? And if that idea is okay, then why not try to make more of a game of it? So we want to build the smallest thing possible as quickly and cheaply as possible so that we can discard the ideas that aren't going to land. When we do find the thing that lands, we can then test the gameplay. How much retention is there in that gameplay? How sustainable is that? So once we know we've got an idea that's attractive, that can attract a low cost of install, and once we know that that game idea will sustain people for a day or two, maybe 7 days, but we're not too worried about longer term, then we can optimize the game. Then we can primarily focus, I think, on optimizing the cost per install, because we want to get as much revenue as possible, but it's all about making the margin as big as possible by reducing costs. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of this. But so from an advantage point of view, this is disadvantage first, disadvantage point of view, the disadvantage of hyper-casual is that failure can hide potential gems. Because, for example, SpaceApe had a game, which is, I think, a driving racing game, and they used a realistic kind of cyberpunky style art, and it didn't work. But when they made a voxel kind of playful art style, it worked. And so Sometimes the way you put together your idea might not work, but you may not know why it hasn't worked. But we still want that fast iteration, so we can't spend too much time analyzing. What that means is we just keep trying and trying and trying. And then if an idea nags at us and we still feel there's something in it, sure, we can rework it. But it is a risk that it can hide potential gems. There's also no focus on retention. One of the biggest lessons I've learned in this industry is retention is a dramatic driver to revenue, particularly around in-app purchases. But we're not worrying about in-app purchases for a hyper-casual game. So maybe that's okay. What I suppose it means is that because we're focusing on low cost, we're trying to see how we can maximize ad revenue, ad eyeballs, and that is at the expense of retention, and it is at the expense of long-term in-app purchases. But that's okay, as long as we're creating a throughput and a business model. So what's good about hyper-casual is that you get this rapid feedback and iteration, but you also get a rapid route to short-term success. And there's some great publishers out there, people like Quali, people like Joypack, people like Boombit, I think, are doing some stuff. There's a whole bunch of really interesting people out there. And increasingly, people like the Voodoos and so on and so forth, increasingly what we're finding is that if you're able to show your ability to produce good quality experiments that can be tested, you can often create a relationship with the publisher that's more like a retainer. So, in fact, I think there's some similarities, arguably, between the way hyper-casual is working and the K-pop industry. I won't go into too much detail on that, but there's an interesting, different dynamic. It's very different from the kind of relationship we have with the traditional games developer-publisher relationship. So, what's at the heart of hyper-casual for me is that essentially it's showing a masterclass of A/B testing. It's saying, here's a set of experiments. Here's what happens when we change what they look like. Here's how those experiments are affected by us optimizing the way that we market that through direct user ads. So the kind of creatives that we use, the kind of placements that we use, the kind of waterfalls that we use is as much a part of the design as the design of the game itself. So really, it's, I think, the epitome of hypothesis-based design. So I'm a big fan of this model. I'm not necessarily always a big fan of hyper-casual games, however, but, that's a different subject. So what I think hyper-casual does brilliantly is it focuses on games that fill time now. They're basically fidget spinners. They're things to occupy me and then feed me ads. But the key that we have to remember when we're making these games is, where is the tease? Where is that sense of unfinished business? There's more I can do. I could have done better. Failure was mine, not the game being horrible to me. And getting that balance right, that tease, that driver to keep repeating is what's going to make your success. So get one simple interaction that is inherently delightful and that leaves you wanting more. That's really at the heart of hyper-casual. And just to get a bit more detail, what I mean by one interaction. So Sky Rollers, I can't remember the name of the game sometimes. Anyway, so this is a Homer Games one. All you're doing here is sliding left and right. And as you slide left and right, the skaters' skates go apart or together. And you've got to basically use that very simple interaction, very direct, very clean, to avoid all the obstacles and to go on to the specific rails. So it's very much in the hands of the player. They have one interaction, they slide left and right, and they have an immediate positive feedback result. And if they get it wrong, it's them getting it wrong. Not saying it's not, difficult. It is difficult, but it is important. Plank, the first example I used, what's going on there? Well, you're tapping and you're holding. And the timing that you hold and release is how long the plank grows. So again, it's entirely at the control of the player. The player is the one doing that choice. So the failure is always the player's failure. Again, it's not easy. You can do it too short, you can do it too long, and you've got to basically look at this kind of slightly odd camera perspective and judge time and growth rates with distance. If you get it perfect, fantastic. but it's a non-trivial exercise. Again, I can't remember the name of this particular game, but on this one, you're pulling back, angling, and releasing. Again, one interaction, a pull, a tap, pull, release. One interaction gives you a result, gives you the engagement, and that doesn't mean that we can only do one interaction games in a traditional sense like these things. We can actually do other types of games, simplifying other experiences. So in this case, it was an idle clicker. Again, I think this is Homey Games. And what we're doing there, we're just basically doing one tap to upgrade so that we get the process. And again, taking that idle mentality, this is a game we're not playing, but simplifying it. You can actually go even simpler. There are games out there which are termed ultra casual, where there is almost no interaction, and yet some people still play it. Interesting relationship between the complexity of the game and how mass market the game will be. I think games always have to be compelling. I think they need a start condition, a challenge, a resolution, and reward. But also they need a tease. So if you can create a good start condition, challenge, resolution, and reward, that feedback loop will drive people forward. Anyway, the key thing is that failure is always an option. And failure is something we need to embrace in all sorts of ways. The win-loss ratio of the player is going to drive their engagement with the game. It's all too easy to assume that if people can play it, they're happy. That's not always the case. People complain about failure in games, but actually, if you get the right balance, failure is what drives our appetite for more play. It's part of what leaves a sense of unfinished business. There should always be something more to do, and that sense of unfinished business is a key part of the anticipation to keep playing. Another aspect of failure, though, is that games can fail. And we need to be absolutely up for that. We need to be able to throw away our emotional connection with a game. We need to be willing to destroy everything that we're doing and really kind of change our expectations about what success looks like. We need to focus on the data. Everything we do is a hypothesis. And we never actually lose if we have a hypothesis, because if the game fails, we have learned something. We need to apply that learning and let it help us drive the next idea and the next idea and the next idea. One of the things about failure that's also worth bearing in mind, though, timing is everything. Thinking about timing. So an idea, if you look at the cycles of hyper-casual games at the moment, you'll see that there are patterns and trends. Part of the reason that happens is people see somebody else coming up with a good idea, and then they just double down and repeat it, and then it becomes depressing and boring, and everyone stops playing it. And then the next one. So that's one aspect. But what you also find is that some people aren't necessarily ready for a mechanic yet. A lot of hyper-casual players are often people who don't have the time or energy or even the inclination to know a lot about games. So if you introduce an exotic game mechanic, it may be that your audience isn't educated to that mechanic's value yet. And that's an important part of understanding that sometimes when the game fails that you test, it's not because it's a bad game. It's sometimes not because it's the bad art. Sometimes it's just wrong thing at the wrong time. So the bottom line is a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It's hard to make simple. It's so much easier to chuck one more thing in, one more element. But actually the biggest challenge is to see how much you can take away. Find game ideas that you love and strip out the things that they don't need. And it's incredibly emotionally difficult to do, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And anyone who's a game designer who can spend time learning how to make hyper-casual games, I believe will become a better designer because of the rigorous enforced simplicity. Something we should take further in any kind of game. So, is hyper-casual still healthy in 2020? The answer is yes. There has been a growth in many ways, but the players involved have changed. There are a lot more different players. They're doing a lot more different things. But what's interesting is the increasing transition to more retention level mechanics. So thinking about the hyper-casual simplicity and looking at how you can create retention on them is starting to become interesting. And I think that retention is focused around a sense of unfinished business and the idea of teasing. So what are the 5 things I want you to take away from this? 1, interaction. Create a sense of unfinished business. Think about extensibility. So how is that 1 interaction going to provide depth? And if you can add to that the ability to add time and score so they can always improve their ability, then that's going to tie into that tease and that desire to want to do better. Kill early. This probably should have been number 1, actually. Kill as soon as possible. And of course, less is more. Okay, so that was basically thinking about hyper-casual. So if that's hyper-casual, what about games as a service? Now, here I've taken Pokemon Go. Is it the right game to use? Is it a good comparison? Are we all going to be able to make a Pokemon Go? No. But I think the data actually speaks for itself. It really communicates what I'm trying to get across about the idea of an ideal game as a service. So probably most of us remember when Pokemon Go came out and how dramatic it was in terms of the volume of people downloading it. So much so, it dwarfed everything else on the app stores. And then it died away. And so for a lot of us, we think, oh, yeah, it's gone away. No, it has not. I think last year was the most successful year Pokemon Go had ever had. So the other thing that's interesting is look at the curve. So if you look at the download curves, you see the peak. And you see a good, solid momentum across the board. But then you look into the revenue model. And yes, there's a peak, but there have been numerous peaks, countless peaks, ongoing peaks that actually exceeded higher than the original peak. Now, that's living games because those peaks are driven by activity. Those peaks are driven by a persistent engagement with an audience. That's the reason why this stuff is so powerful. So in developing a game as a service, it's a different way of thinking. We start with market analysis. We start looking at what is the gap in the market? Where are the audience? What do the audience want? What are the specific behaviors? Are there games that fill that need? It's a problem solving. Panina talked about this earlier in the panel. The idea of fulfilling and solving a problem is kind of at the heart of this development process. We design and we prototype and we do as much as possible in terms of testing, but we can't do the same radical evolutionary process that you do in hyper-casual. Well, people haven't. We'll come back to that later. But traditionally, you don't do that kind of, let's just get it out there. Once we know what we're making, we prototyped it, we do the development. So there's a lot of work that goes on before we ever get into our classic alpha, beta, open beta, soft launch, live process. That means the market testing is after a huge amount of development work. So there's a huge amount of sunk costs before we get to market testing. And that means there's a high risk, a massively high risk. People can spend millions of dollars just getting to the point of getting to test. And if it doesn't work, it's game over. So more than that, there are all sorts of other things. Understanding the way to mitigate those risks is to basically look at finding ways to focus down on a true minimum viable product. So that means really knuckling down on the simplest thing, which, if you think about it, is essentially what HyperCasual is trying to do, but they're doing it more extreme. If we can work out what the smallest thing is we can deliver, one of the joys of making a game as a service is we don't have to give up on our longer term features. You don't have to kill your darlings. They're just things that you defer to later. So we can focus on player utility in a way that a hyper-casual game cannot. We can focus on what players love, why they love it, and how we build on that. What we can also do is look at our features that we would love to put in, all these extra layers, all of that complexity. We can look at where we can bring that out and use them as things to look forward to in next month's release, and the month after that's release, and the month after that's release, because we can experiment, we can build and adjust, and we can save the game. Games like Warframe, which when they launched were okay, but now are powerhouses because the developers double down on live operations. So what's going on with game servers? I think they're like onions. You start with the mechanics. So you've got a start condition, challenge, resolution, and reward, just as I said earlier. And the T's are very similar in some ways. Just a quick comment here. So I was asked on the data, as I said before, the Pokemon Go and the Plank stats are from Reflection, which is from Game Refinery. Reflection is basically a Nap Annie. It's slightly cheaper though. So this is kind of the same thing, really, as a hyper-casual game. There's actually lots of similarity in the game mechanic, even of a game as a service, although often games as a service will have multiple mechanics, but bear with me. There's a lot of similarity in the core mechanic of a game, the core loop, as a hyper-casual game. Maybe a little bit more complex, but it's very similar in principle. Then we have to add on to the extensibility. So there we're looking at how does time affect the game? Can you do things faster, slower, whatever? What's the score that you can get? Where does the skill come in? Where does the grind element come in? How does choice affect the gameplay? What attributes can you use? Now, these are really important. If you don't have extensibility in a game mechanic, you can't really offer power-ups that are meaningful. That means you can't offer upgrades. You can't offer things that you can sell. It's really important to understand how the game mechanic core can be extended and create engagement. And then I'll move on from that. So then you look at things like purpose of progression. How can I look back at what I've done and look forward to what I can achieve? When I do achieve things, why is it meaningful? Why am I now looking forward to the next thing I can achieve? Where's that sense of unfinished business, which I mentioned before? Where's the economy? Now, with economy, I'm often talking about this idea of a kind of imbalance. I talk about the hot dog economy. So basically, when you buy hot dogs, you buy them in packs of 8. When you buy hot dog buns, they come in packs of 6s. Why? Because I always need more buns, so I go buy more buns. Then I need more hot dogs, there I buy more hot dogs. This sense of imbalance is really key to driving a lot of successful games. I'm obsessed with Fallout 76. I'm trying to have a break at the moment. I spent too much time, so many hours playing it, primarily because it became available as part of Xbox Game Pass, but that's another story. But the thing that keeps you playing that game is all of the effort you've got to go through to get your food, your health pack, stim packs, your ammo, your weapon upgrades, your armor upgrades, all of the stuff that keeps you alive. Most of the game is about keeping you alive. The Long Dark, similar principle. It's mostly about keeping you alive, and that keeps you sustained. And you then do all that, and then you go and do a mission. And that gives you a sense of purpose and progress on that mission. But I've had to do other stuff. Optimization really matters. Yeah, I use Scissor, Paper, Stone, Lizard, Spock as their kind of idea of the mechanic, because it kind of hopefully makes sense about that. Anticipation. Cannot stress this enough. You need to anticipate the value of coming back. If you're not leaving your players thinking and wanting more, then your game's over. So that's what the context loop is. The context loop is, why will I keep playing? So if you think about it, the mechanic is what we do. The context is why we think about, coming back. But the meta game is everything else that's not the game. So this is where we talk about cultural expression. How do I show off? What's my customization? Why am I going to show off this game on YouTube? Where's that zeitgeist moment where some band are going to play in the game world, and therefore you're going to go in there regardless? My friends are going to be doing their homework in Fortnite, whatever it might be. What's that cultural zeitgeist that your game delivers? And even mobile games can offer some of these elements. Where you've got a shared moment, where you have the thumbs up in Golf Clash when your opponent has just done a hole-in-one and you basically lost before you even started. That's the sort of stuff that makes that kind of moment matter. Social engagement, whether it's competition or collaboration, is incredibly important. And making it vital, making it desirable, making it engaging really matters. But we mustn't forget that players have things in their lives outside of our experience. So we have to work out where the lifestyle fit is for our game. and also the mode of use. So the devices that we're expecting them to play on, how that affects the way they play. There's a lot of stuff going on in a game. And obviously, that's before we start running live ops. And when we start running live ops, we've got to think about events. Events are a part of an engagement engine. We drive people's playing through daily, weekly, and monthly activity, driven through configurations, hopefully. We want content. What we've learned is that sustainable delivery of content is much more important than how much content. I would much rather release a new outfit every week than 50 every 3 months, because by that time it's too late. We want people to see that the game is alive and engaging. I think also features, releasing them predictably and sustainably is important as well. But we shouldn't forget that when we're running events, we want to think about the experience of the player. So part of that is going to be, we want them to buy stuff that goes along with the live experience. We give them promotions, things that they value. But we have to focus on player value. What do they care about? Why is it meaningful? One of the games that didn't work, that I was trying to help save, was had a fantastic kind of Golf Clash style competition thing. Some great bundles and offers. You had to upgrade your balls, your football. It was a football game. You're kicking the ball into goal. You had to upgrade your balls. You had to upgrade your outfits, upgrade your tactics, your defenders, all sorts of great stuff. But no one did. And turned out because there was no stake. Because they didn't actually have 100 gold before you play the game, whoever wins gets to keep the 200 gold. It didn't seem as important to upgrade your characters. Therefore, the rewards you got didn't matter. Therefore, the buying didn't matter. So working out how you structure monetization, how you get people to care about what they want and why they want it, you will fail. Community is part of that as well. Being honest, authentic, and open and engaging. Again, focusing on what players love really matters. And also not forgetting that you've got to bear in mind problem management. There's a lot of stuff that goes on with games as a service. But the important thing is, you don't have to solve it all at once. You can solve it as a journey. And in fact, actually, some of the hints of that comes when we start looking beyond that and start looking at hybrid casual games. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But let's go into a little bit more detail. One of the things about, I think, games in general, but I think it's particularly around games as a service, is the player is what matters. Not what you think, what they care about is what matters. With a game as a service, we're thinking about the life cycle. With a hyper-casual game, we simply need to get people over the barrier to access. Now, where it's a paid upfront game, there is a paywall. Where it's a non-pay upfront game, or hyper-casual, obviously ad-funded, we're talking about having the barrier of like all of the vast quantity of other games out there, all of the difficulties of going to find it, discovery, but also the background problem of, do I have enough space on my phone? What am I going to have to delete in order to play this game? You've got to have enough compulsion to get people over that hump, regardless of whether you're a hyper-casual or a game as a service. The interesting thing is that if you're a hyper-casual game, you don't care after you get them past that. You do want to retain them to an extent. So this curve does exist, but the time frame we're talking about is much lower. With a live ops game, we absolutely have to engage people through a learning curve. So you end up with this cycle of like discovery, learning. And learning is not just about learning how to play the game. It's also about how the game fits into your routine. Then it's about super engaging, re-engaging, and churning. I won't go into this with the time. I've spent too much talking about hyper-casual and gas, but essentially we're talking about activating players throughout the process. So what are the lessons from games as a service? Well, number one, simple, extensible play, which is very similar to hyper-casual games. Simplicity matters, even in a game as a service. We add layers of complexity in a game as a service. We don't start with complexity. We want that unfinished business, but we have to have a sense of purpose and progression, or the game will not succeed. We also want to deliver what I call predictable surprise. You need that reliable knowledge that there's going to be new content, new features, new events, new daily challenges, new weekly challenges, new monthly challenges, collaborative themes. We need to know they're coming, but not know what they're going to be. And when they come, we need to be delighted by them. And the biggest difference between hyper-casual and games as a service is we care about the player life cycle. That's a really important thing to get across. So surely we can just take a hyper-casual game, slap on the metagame, everything works. Well, no, it doesn't. It's like trying to slap rockets onto the back of a pedal cycle. It just breaks and it gets very dangerous. We've got to understand that different games have different models. Whether it's a hyper-casual game at one end or EVE Online at another, depth and complexity increases as you move from one to the other, but so too reduces the potential reach. Mass market needs simplicity. Deeply engaged users who spend a lot requires complexity, but it is going to be a smaller audience. We also have to think about monetization. Different monetization has different impacts in a game as a service. You need to think about the friction. So an in-world ad experience will probably have very little friction. Even use of soft currency, the currency I earn, spending that is something that has a level of friction. I've earned that. It's part of my score. Now you want me to reduce my effective overall score? Rewarded ads I'm a massive fan of, but that's probably not going to surprise anyone. Interstitials can be difficult, but the interesting thing is the effect that they have in hyper-casual games because of the placement of them. Placement of an interstitial is so important. In a hyper-casual game, playing intensely, watching an ad as a break, playing intensely, watching a break. The net friction that causes does not change the life cycle of the player. They are quick turnaround games. So having more ads in front of people who play those games is not as much of an issue as you might instinctively think. But then when we start talking about real money, there's a massive difference between free and ad view versus spending money. So you have to think about value. You have to think about purchase experiences. And if you're going to go into recurring payments, so VIP schemes and so on and so forth, battle passes is an amazing model. Again, you've got to really deep down and think, it is a privilege that a player gives you real cash. You have to earn that privilege. It's also worth thinking about what content is. Content's not always what you think it is. Sometimes content's about collecting things. Sometimes it's about the progression. I've talked about the optimization, the hot dog economics. But content can also be narrative, both for the game and the journey of the game overall. So that Games as a Service can have new updates on a seasonal basis. Path of Exile, for example, does an amazing job of that. But it also can be a personal journey as a player. What did I experience? What did I do? But actually, I think the thing we misunderstand and need to pay more attention to is often the best content out there is other players. One of the joys about hyper-casual is that we can do repurposing. It's also something we can think about in managing games as live ops. And at the end of the day, the ultimate in-app purchases done well and efficiently in games as services is when the content itself is data. Again, I'm not going to try and go too much detail there. Let's go and talk about the last bit. I've only got 15 minutes left. I want to try and just talk through this briefly. And that is the hybrid casual model. So hybrid casual is basically a kind of label that's been attached to games like Arch Hero. Why do I love Arch Hero? It comes down to this data curve. So it's essentially a hyper-casual game mechanic with retention context added to it. So again, an initial peak and a relatively high. This is a very short period of time, by the way. I don't have the full thing. But then look at the revenue numbers. They're basically flat. I don't mean that in a bad way. That's a great thing. They don't have the dip down that they do in the other game models. Why? Because they've managed to find a game that's immediately rewarding, immediately engaging, and long-term sustaining. Now, there is a problem, which because I took this data earlier in the year, I should update it. There is a problem with this game where you run out of desirability to play around the middle of the long term of the game. So it does have a shorter life cycle than traditional games as a service. But what's interesting is they've broken it down into layers. You've got a map that lets you know where you are in a particular story. So it's a personal journey. You've got an in-game session randomizer, which makes you make a tactical choice that applies for that game only and builds. So your tactical choice builds. So you're building a unique experience, even if the game story is the same. You also have this bullet hell kind of moment, which gives you loot. And that loot, you upgrade your character. They even have a battle pass-like element where if you are buying into the subscription offer, you get even more rewards and increasing your progression. That I think is brilliant. And I think really at the heart of it, that's what we're trying to get across with this story. We can start, and this is partly Prechia, I probably butchered your name now, I'm so sorry, asked for the very first project of Indie, would you personally suggest HyperCasual or Gas? I would say start with HyperCasual. In fact, I would say even experienced studios. We want to find mechanics that are going to work with an audience. So let's start by having lots of experiments. And whether you're planning to make a game as a service or a hyper-casual, let's think like hyper-casual games. Let's get out there and do lots and lots of game mechanics and find out what actually lands, what gets people's interest and sustains their interest. Once we've built our mechanic, and maybe we need to do 100 ideas to have 10 mechanics that work. Once we've got that and we've proved that works, why don't we then test what the context loop looks like for those 10 mechanics? And maybe only one of them works with an extendable context. That context loop could be a tournament. It could be a narrative arc. But whatever gives a sense of purpose and progression to that core mechanic. Now we've gone from having a hyper-casual to a hybrid casual, essentially. What if you then add the metagame, the social layers, and the other integration, and test that? That's when you can start looking at games as a service, where we can find a game mechanic that works, that is extensible, that we can test, that we can build retention layers for, that we can build long-term feature updates for. We can actually turn around this model completely and benefit from the simplicity and cost reductions by looking at how we get the right mechanic that's got the best cost for install and the best day one retention, and then use more to bring in the experience longer term by adding a sense of purpose and progression and ongoing retention. That's when we bring in live operations. That's when we bring in events, which can drive a daily, weekly, and monthly series of activities, promotions, which can convert some of those activities into revenue. But then think about content and feature releases as a continuous tested pipeline. That allows us to take our hyper-casual game to a hybrid casual game to a game as a service, but focusing on building community, building growth, and driving revenue. That means getting more players, doing more things, more often, and for longer. So it's basically the lesson I want you to take away from all that is look at your game as a hypothesis and think about the ways that you would like to grow that and create sustainability. Start out with the hyper-casual model, see what sticks. If you find a bunch of hyper-casual models that can last and that you can build context layers on, let's see how that turns into a hybrid casual game. But again, by looking at it systematically, by reducing costs, I believe that we can build sustainable experiences, that we can then add live event management on that and make and build sustainable communities. And that's what we're trying to do as a company. We try to build experiences that people care about and sustainability. And if you're interested, we also do a bunch of free game reviews. So if you've got a game out there you want to have reviewed, that it needs to be a game that has the potential to do games as a service for us. But so we're happy to look and talk to people about reviewing those games. We also have an events calendar, finances list. This actually is a UK-focused finances list, so and a knowledge base of articles, lots of recordings of talks like this. So there's a whole bunch of questions. I've only got a few minutes to answer some of them, so I'm going to do my best. I think I've answered the first one. Where am I seeing game stats like Pokemon Go and Plank? Well, that comes from Reflection. Reflection.io. It's a data platform that's from Game Refinery. I'm a big fan of those guys. If you do go to Game Refinery, please tell them I sent you. They'd be delighted to know that. So there's a question here about failure for Amazon's Crucible as a game launched and is now folded. I don't want to go into specifics of a particular studio's failure. I think it's too hard to know from the outside. Generally, I would say it's about testing early and scope. They're the two things that really matter. There's no point in building until you know the game is going to work. And I think a lot of games have gone through a process where they've gone through the traditional AAA model of build it and they will come. I'm not saying that's why this game failed. I'm just saying that's a possibility. Market testing. How market testing is done for hyper-casual games to decide if the game passed and failed. So the numbers are very specific to the different teams that you work. If you go to Network 3, or I still want to say Network 3, but it's Network with the 3 in it. Or you go to Tilting Point, or you go to Us, or if you go to even like the Koalis, who are great for hyper-casual, or Joypack, who do a great job in terms of China-based audiences, they have different numbers. But my general principle is for a hyper-casual game, I'm looking for at least 40% day one retention, probably 60% target. I'm also looking for a sub-$1, probably a sub-50-cent cost per install. You have to think about the average cost per install for a game like that, because that's really the key driver. A lot of games are looking for sub-20-cent cost per install. Think about that. So if you can get people interested enough in your game that it only costs you 20 cents per average install, that's what real success looks like. Getting to that's non-trivial. It's not just about the game, although that's a key part. It's about the placement, the targeting, and the systematic testing of how you market that game. But yeah, so to start off with, I'm looking at sub-$1, but I have to feel like I can optimize that. Typically, I'm using Facebook ads just because they're so targetable, and it's easy to do some testing on small amounts of money. How important is it to add multiple languages? Again, the answer is depends. The vast majority of territories who play and spend money on hyper-casual games, I did a recent analysis, the vast majority are English-speaking, so you can get away with English-speaking to a large extent. However, there is a dramatic impact if you're able to localize to the specific territory. And I don't just mean language, I also mean culturalize. And it's really just some simple rules of thumb. For example, don't have an avatar system which takes you down to underwear in Middle Eastern territories. It's just not worth it. Don't do a zombie story in Asian markets. It's just not worth it. Now, you can get away with them in some circumstances, but it's really, really key to think about, just do what you can as a minimum. Even things like color blindness. Thinking about what colors you choose. And so if you take the most mass market simple choices to make sure that you have some simple rules in place to minimize the issue. So, for example, try to avoid having any words in your onboarding. If you can do that, you don't need to worry about localization and culturalization because you've already minimized the impact needed. Where else are us? I think the first project we talked about HyperCasual versus Gas, and I think I've answered that one okay, hopefully. You'll let me know, I'm sure. Does hybrid casual games have to be HTML5 and web-based? No, absolutely not. Unity's Unreal, no problem at all. The issue with using Unity and Unreal is merely about how big the game is to download. In theory, there's no issue whatsoever. There are some advantages in going HTML5 with certain platforms, particularly kind of if you go Facebook Messenger type stuff or Kakao or WeChat and things like that. So if you're working with a communication messaging platform, yes, sure, web-based, makes sense. But in general, I wouldn't worry about it. You can just put something together quickly on the Google early access testing is fantastic. I thoroughly recommend using that as much as possible. Is hyper-casual a big thing? Yeah, it's a huge thing. But it's actually, I think, more important not to worry about the specifics because the hyper-casual publishers largely have it wrapped up because they've got amazing processes to make their delivery really efficient. But that doesn't mean that's the only value in doing it. For my mind, it's not about hyper-casual. It's about the design philosophy that hyper-casual has proven. and how we apply that philosophy to make our chances of success much higher. Hopefully that makes sense. When do you stop iterating over a prototype? Time box it, is my view. And in fact, over a prototype, basically you've got 2 days, one idea. Don't iterate, just get it out there. And get data. Iteration should come after data. And only if that thing shows enough data success to be worth iterating on. So if you're not getting 40% day one retention, kill it. Don't waste time iterating it, kill it. Now, I say that as somebody who completely fails to do this. I don't live up to my own promises here. I've got 3 games that I've had on the shelf for a year. I haven't got around and done that testing. And basically my aim to do that is simply, I get a video of gameplay, I put it on Facebook, I do an ad to a fake website. Well, actually not a fake website, it's a website, but it's not intended to be a permanent website. And I basically drive people to there, get them to sign up to a MailChimp, and basically what I'm looking at is how many people went from the ad to the website. And that gives me my cost per install. So I now know, does that game have enough attraction to get people to go? Then I'll release it on Google, the early access stuff, and I'll do another Facebook ad directly to get that, those installs. Again, targeted really closely. I'm wanting to spend $100, $200, $500, nothing more than that. I want to get the day 1 data. I want to get the day 7 data if I can, but day 1 and day 3 will give me enough insight to know, is this working? And it's day 60 before you add it. Well, ideally I would chuck in, you don't have to even put the ads in, but if you can put the ads in, great, do it. Don't worry about interstitial dropout for a hyper-casual game. Frankly, if your game is compelling enough, you shouldn't see any significant dropout for day 1, even with interstitials. Now, that's really blanket, and it's probably not quite true. But if you're worrying about it, you're worrying about the wrong thing, because it's got to be able to cope with interstitials if you're doing hyper-casual specifically. If it doesn't cope with interstitials, there's something wrong with the game and you should go back to the drawing board. So I'm kind of trying to say it's the wrong question to ask at the early stages. Later on, absolutely want to make sure we optimize the placement of the ad so that we minimize the fallout. And there will be fallout. But I just want to get the emphasis on the initial testing there. Can we do market Facebook testing and Facebook Insight? To be honest, I'm not too sure. I think so. But it's just, you're releasing a game. It's just releasing a game. But you're taking a hit. The risk is, if you're using a channel and you're doing an original game, you're basically foreshadowing what the game will be. And if the game isn't polished, you'll lose the halo effect that you get when you first release a game. So you've got to be a bit careful about it. One of the advantages of releasing in the way I've described, using a video ad and Google Early Access in particular, is, or even through test flight, to be honest. You could do it through test flight, or it's more complicated, but you can do it. The reason why that's useful is you don't lose the halo effect. You can get it out there, you can restrict the number of people who see it, you can make it really clean and easy. And to a certain extent, we've stopped worrying about soft launches for this kind of game, because we can do it across multiple territories with relatively little impact. Do I see the market, the gaming platform ecosystem going like this for console, mobile, VR and AR? Absolutely. I say that as somebody who ran free-to-play. I say ran. I was home architect, which meant I was doing the politics between the different regions. The regions actually did the running of the PlayStation Home experience, but it was a free-to-play experience. There's nothing intrinsically about platform that prevents these techniques from working, except hyper-casual fits the mode of use of a phone perfectly. When I'm going to play on my console, I am going to have to tell my family to get out of the front room or go and play on their phones, and I'm having to pay a social price in my family to play on my console. If I'm going to go play on a PC, I'm going to go and segregate myself from my family, and I'm going to expect with both of those experiences a much longer term play mode. If I'm playing on a tablet, it's not quite so extreme as the two, it's somewhere between the two. So whilst it is true I think that these techniques are going to affect all these platforms. They won't affect them in exactly the same way. The techniques will be useful, but their application and their use and the way that they tap into the player experience will be different because the platforms do different things. What resources do you recommend to find out what has worked past few years for us? I mean, it's a good question. I'm not really sure how best to answer that. I mean, yes, go look at data sources like App Annie, like Apptopia. As I say, I use Reflection.io. I also like what the Game Refinery do with their game score. They've got a fantastic blog as well. It's well worth checking out Game Refinery's blog. I love what they do for that. So there's a really good understanding of that. Read, go play things, play board games as well as mobile games, as well as console games. Basically, there's a quote from Stephen King in his book called On Writing. He's Stephen King, the famous horror writer. He wrote a fantastic book about his recovery from an accident and also how he approaches writing. The comment he says is that to be a writer, you've got to write 2 hours a day and read 2 hours a day. I think the same thing applies to games. We've got to play 2 hours a day and make 2 hours a day, or we're not really game makers. And it's a bit of an extreme way to put it, but the more we dive into game making, the more that we have an authentic love for games, the more that we understand and listen and collaborate with other game makers and have a passion that we share with others. There's a reason why I do things like this, is because I have to get my experience and thoughts in order and try to share them with people like yourselves. And hopefully I've managed to do that. And if I have, thank you very much. And I think I'm out of time. But hopefully you can follow up with us, check out fundamentally.games, see what we do to help developers. We're actually working with an Indian studio at the moment, helping them move from apps to doing hyper-casual games and building a framework for them so that they can move to games as a service. But this principle I've been talking to you about is exactly the way that we're helping them. So we're very open to helping people out there. And hopefully that is me done. I don't know if anyone's got any final thoughts, but yeah. So VJ, I think that's me done. Unless there's any last minute questions, last minute thoughts, I'll think about it. If anyone's after copies of these slides, by the way, please feel free to email me hi@fundamentally.games. You can even find me online on LinkedIn or Twitter. My Twitter handle is a strange one, but just do a Google search for Oscar Clark Games and you'll find me. Great. I'm trying to work out if they're going to kick me out or if I'm going to keep talking. Just see if there's any last minute questions. Yeah, I think that's us done. Great. In that case, then, I'm going to say thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful. If anyone wants to follow it through, then please say. And again, the videos for this will be shared. Good stuff. Thanks, always. Hope it was useful.